The railway cars gleamed under the Virginia sun, their polished exteriors reflecting clouds drifting across the summer sky. These were not the cattle wagons or freight cars that prisoners had expected, but actual passenger coaches with upholstered seats and windows that opened to admit fresh air. American soldiers gestured for the Germans to board, their manner more suggestive of transit officials than prison guards. Inside, the prisoners found themselves in surroundings that exceeded the comfort of many trains they had ridden even before the war. Cushioned benches ran along both sides of each car. Overhead racks provided storage for the few possessions prisoners still carried. The floors were clean, the windows unbroken, the whole atmosphere one of ordinary civilian transport rather than the movement of captive enemy combatants. As the trains pulled away from the coastal areas and began their journey westward, the true nature of American openness became apparent. No one attempted to close curtains or block windows. No guards ordered prisoners to avert their eyes from strategic locations. Instead, the route cut directly through populated areas, industrial zones, and agricultural regions, offering an unobstructed view of American society in motion. Through those open windows, the captured soldiers witnessed scenes that would have been carefully hidden in any European nation at war. Men pushed lawnmowers across suburban yards, maintaining their property with peacetime concern for appearances. Children clustered around ice cream vendors, their faces sticky with summer treats. Young couples walked arm in arm through town squares, apparently unconcerned about the war raging on distant continents. At station platforms, where the trains paused briefly, civilian passengers and railway workers stared at the prisoners with curiosity rather than hatred. Some people waved, whether in greeting or simple acknowledgement was unclear, but the gesture itself seemed incredible to men who expected to be despised. The abundance visible from those railway carriages accumulated like a mathematical proof of American prosperity. Factories appeared at regular intervals, their smokestacks marking the landscape like industrial monuments. Unlike German plants that had been forced underground or heavily camouflaged against air raids, these American facilities sat openly, making no attempt to disguise their purpose or capacity. Automobile dealerships displayed rows of new vehicles, civilian cars and trucks that would have been impossible to see in Germany, where every resource had been commandeered for military purposes. The trains passed close enough to some assembly plants that prisoners could observe production in progress. Near Baltimore, the Glenn Martin aircraft factory sprawled across acres of land, and through its massive windows, dozens of bomber aircraft in various stages of construction were clearly visible. The prisoners counted them, comparing what they saw in a single American plant to the monthly output of entire German factories. The numbers they tallied were profoundly discouraging for anyone still believing in German industrial supremacy. The sensory experiences of those train journeys imprinted themselves on memory with unusual clarity. The rhythmic clacking of wheels over rail joints provided a constant percussion beneath every other sound. The whistle's mournful call announced crossings and stations. Wind rushed through open windows, carrying the scents of farmland, factories, and small-town America. At stations where the trains stopped for coal or water, the smells grew more specific and more tantalizing. Coffee percolated in station diners, its rich aroma drifting into the railway cars where prisoners sat with empty stomachs. Hamburgers sizzled on griddles, their smell mixing with fried onions and fresh bread. These were not the sparse rations that German civilians had grown accustomed to, but meals that suggested abundance verging on waste. One incident that multiple prisoners later recounted involved watching a station porter bite into a large, bright red apple, chew thoughtfully for a moment, then casually toss the half-eaten fruit into a garbage bin. For men who had not seen such casual disposal of food in years, the gesture spoke volumes about relative plenty. In Germany, every scrap was precious, every crumb salvaged. Here, fresh fruit could be discarded without a second thought. The image of that apple arcing into the trash container became, for some prisoners, a more powerful symbol than any propaganda poster. It represented the gap between their nation's claims and American reality. The statistical evidence visible from the trains supported these individual observations. American railways in 1943 moved more than 2.5 million passengers daily, while simultaneously handling freight volumes that dwarfed European capacity. Coal production exceeded 600 million tons annually, double what the Reich could manage even before Allied bombing campaigns disrupted mining operations. The prisoners did not need access to official figures to understand the implications. Every loaded freight car they saw, every train that passed going the opposite direction, every siding stacked with raw materials testified to productive capacity that made German industrial achievement look modest by comparison. For soldiers who had been assured of their nation's technological and economic superiority, the evidence rolling past their windows was devastating. The journey also carried psychological weight beyond the mere observation of prosperity. These prisoners were not being hidden from the American public, tucked away in secret convoys that moved only at night. Instead, they traveled openly, visible to anyone who cared to look. The American government apparently had no fear that its civilians would panic at seeing enemy soldiers, no concern that the presence of prisoners might undermine morale or provoke disorder. This confidence in social stability was itself a kind of strength that prisoners recognized and respected. In Germany, such openness would have been unthinkable. Captured Allied soldiers were moved under cover, their presence concealed from civilians who might react unpredictably. The contrast suggested that American society possessed a cohesion and resilience that German propaganda had consistently denied. Some civilians went beyond mere observation to active kindness. At certain stops, families approached the train cars with offerings of food. Sandwiches wrapped in waxed paper passed through windows. Bottles of cold water or soda appeared. These gestures came without fanfare or official sanction, simply individual acts of human compassion toward young men who happened to be designated as enemies. The prisoners receiving such gifts found themselves confused by the contradiction between their status and their treatment. How could these people be the barbarous, materialistic monsters described in German newsreels? How could a nation supposedly weak and decadent produce such casual generosity toward those who had fought against its soldiers? Newspapers from that period occasionally mentioned the prisoner transports, brief notices that German POWs had been spotted at this station or that, usually including observations about their youth or their worn appearance. Some journalists noted the exhausted faces visible through train windows, the torn uniforms that spoke of hard fighting in North African deserts. A few papers published photographs, grainy images of captured soldiers looking bewildered as they passed through American territory. These media mentions treated the prisoners as a curiosity rather than a threat, another sign of how the war was progressing, but not something that required fear or hostility from ordinary citizens. The trains themselves became classrooms in relative prosperity. Every mile revealed new evidence. Water towers rose at regular intervals, ensuring reliable supply to communities large and small. Grain elevators dominated small-town skylines, their bulk suggesting harvest abundance. Telegraph wires strung along the tracks connected every hamlet to a national communications network. The infrastructure alone, mundane and unglamorous, represented investment and organization that impressed even skeptical observers. These were not emergency wartime measures, but the ordinary operation of a peacetime economy that had shifted into military production without sacrificing civilian function. For prisoners who had experienced the grinding shortages of German wartime life, the contrast was almost unbearable. They remembered ration cards that bought less each month. They recalled cities where entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble by bombing raids. They knew of factories operating at partial capacity due to material shortages and power disruptions. Yet here, visible through train windows, lay a country that seemed hardly touched by war. Yes, young men were absent, serving in uniform overseas. Yes, certain luxuries had disappeared from store shelves. But the fundamental machinery of civilian life continued operating smoothly, producing enough for both military and domestic needs. Doubt crept into minds prepared by years of ideological certainty. If their leaders had lied about American weakness, what other lies had they been told? If the enemy possessed such overwhelming productive capacity, how could victory have ever been achievable? These questions had no comfortable answers, so many prisoners pushed them aside, focusing instead on immediate concerns about their own fate. But the seeds had been planted, the evidence accumulated, and with every passing mile, the foundation of belief in their cause eroded a little more. The destinations toward which these trains carried their passengers would intensify the cognitive dissonance. The prisoner of war camps awaiting them represented another paradox, places of confinement that nevertheless offered amenities and opportunities exceeding what many Germans knew in freedom. Medicine, food, shelter, and eventually education would demonstrate that America's approach to captivity diverged radically from what prisoners expected. The contradictions visible from train windows were merely preparation for contradictions. They would live daily behind barbed wire fences. When the trains finally reached their destinations and the prisoners disembarked onto station platforms in places like Texas, New Mexico, or the upper Midwest, they stepped into American communities that viewed them with curiosity rather than malice. Local residents gathered to watch the unusual sight of enemy soldiers marching through their towns. Some spectators showed hostility, certainly, particularly those who had lost sons or brothers in combat. But more common was simple interest, the same attention that might greet any unusual occurrence in a small town where excitement was rare. Children pointed and whispered. Elderly men who had fought in the previous war studied the prisoners with knowing looks. Women clutched purses and watched silently, their faces revealing complicated mixtures of emotions that prisoners could not easily interpret. The camps themselves came into view as the final leg of each journey concluded. Rows of wooden barracks stretched across cleared land, laid out with military precision. Guard towers stood at intervals along perimeter fences, their searchlights ready to sweep the grounds after dark. Barbed wire marked clear boundaries between captivity and freedom. Yet even in these first glimpses, certain details suggested that this imprisonment would differ from what the prisoners had anticipated. The barracks looked new, constructed recently for this specific purpose. Electricity poles carried power lines to every building. What appeared to be a hospital wing occupied one corner of the compound, and in the center, a large open area suggested space for recreation or assembly, not merely the cramped confinement that characterized military prisons in Europe. The gates swung open to receive them, and the next chapter of their captivity began. What awaited inside those fences would challenge everything they thought they knew about how nations treated captured enemies. Medical care that rivaled what their own soldiers received, food that exceeded their rations back home, and amenities that made captivity feel less like punishment than like involuntary residence in a strange land. The psychological impact of such treatment would prove as strategically significant as any battlefield victory, transforming enemy combatants into witnesses of a different way of organizing society. A different set of values, a different relationship between state and citizen. As the prisoners filed through the gates and began the processing that would assign them to barracks and work details, Many experienced a moment of profound disorientation. Nothing about this matched their expectations. The journey from African battlefields to American detention camps had been surreal enough, but the reality of life inside these compounds would prove even more bewildering. They had come as warriors in service of what they had been told was a superior civilization. They would leave having seen a society that demonstrated superiority not through conquest, but through the simple yet revolutionary act of treating its enemies as human beings, deserving of basic dignity and care. The transformation had begun before they even realized it was happening. Started with a harbor scene that contradicted propaganda, continued with train rides through prosperous landscapes, and would now deepen into daily experiences that rewired understanding of what nations could be and how they might treat one another even in the midst of total war. The camp that many prisoners came to know best was Hearne in Texas, though dozens of similar facilities dotted the American landscape from coast to coast. Built in late 1942 by military engineers working at remarkable speed, Hearne sprawled across more than 700 acres of flat Texas terrain. The compound could house nearly 5,000 men, a population exceeding that of the nearby town sharing its name. From above, the camp would have looked like a small city, its grid of streets and blocks laid out with the precision that characterized American military planning. The first paradox struck prisoners as they were assigned to barracks and given their initial orientation. Each building had electricity, not just dim bulbs powered by unreliable generators, but proper wiring connected to the Texas power grid, providing current for lights, fans, and other conveniences. For men who had grown up in rural areas where electrification remained incomplete even in peacetime, the idea of having electric lighting as prisoners seemed absurd. Ceiling fans rotated lazily in the summer heat, stirring air that otherwise would have been suffocating in the Texas climate. Light bulbs provided illumination at the flip of a switch, no need for candles or oil lamps or sitting in darkness after sunset. The prisoners wandered through their assigned quarters, touching these amenities as if verifying their reality. Bunks lined the walls, each with a thin mattress that nevertheless represented more comfort than many had known in military service. Footlockers provided storage for personal items. Windows had screens to keep out insects, a small detail that suggested attention to living conditions rather than mere warehousing of captives. One former prisoner, writing his memoirs decades later, admitted that his first thought upon entering the barracks was that some mistake had been made, that these facilities were intended for American troops, and the Germans had been directed to the wrong buildings by accident. Only when guards confirmed the assignments did he accept that this was indeed where enemy prisoners would live. The camp hospital reinforced the sense of surreal reversal. Located in a dedicated wing of the compound, it contained examination rooms, a surgical theater, recovery wards, and pharmaceutical storage that would have made many German field hospitals envious. American and German doctors worked side by side, the latter being captured physicians who had been allowed to continue practicing medicine under supervision. The antiseptic smell of carbolic acid and other disinfectants filled the corridors, familiar to anyone who had spent time in medical facilities, but somehow more intense here, suggesting standards of cleanliness that went beyond military necessity. Equipment gleamed with recent manufacture. Bandages and gauze were plentiful rather than rationed. And most remarkably, the medicine cabinets contained supplies of penicillin, the wonder drug that had revolutionized the treatment of bacterial infections. German military medicine in 1943 still relied primarily on sulfur drugs and traditional antiseptics. Penicillin production in the Reich remained minimal, constrained by limited fermentation capacity and competing resource demands. American pharmaceutical companies, by contrast, had scaled up production to levels that seemed almost magical to European observers. By 1944, American factories would produce tens of billions of units annually, enough to treat not only wounded American servicemen, but also, astoundingly, enemy prisoners who fell ill or required surgery. The first time a German soldier watched an American medic inject penicillin into a fellow prisoner suffering from an infected wound, the psychological impact was profound. They were using this precious medicine on us, on their enemies, as if we were their own men. The gesture spoke of resources so abundant that even adversaries could be treated with the best available care. Survival rates in the camp hospital exceeded 95%, matching or bettering the outcomes achieved in military hospitals treating American soldiers. German physicians who worked there found themselves in professional conversations with their American counterparts, discussing techniques and sharing knowledge as colleagues rather than as victor and vanquished. The collegial atmosphere surprised those who participated in it. No one mocked them for having lost battles or served the wrong cause. Instead, medical questions were discussed on their merits, patient care was approached collaboratively, and professional respect transcended political divides. One German doctor, reflecting on his time in the camp hospital, noted that he had never felt like a prisoner when wearing his white coat, only like a physician, doing what physicians do regardless of nationality or political circumstance. But perhaps nothing spoke more clearly about American abundance than the food. Meals in the camp were served 3 times daily in mess halls that operated with the efficiency of civilian cafeterias. The caloric content of the rations averaged 3,400 calories per person per day, roughly double what civilians in Germany received and exceeding even what German soldiers at the front could expect. Breakfast might include eggs, bacon, toast, coffee, and jam. Lunch offered meat, vegetables, bread, and fruit. Dinner repeated the pattern with variations. The food was not gourmet cuisine, but it was plentiful, nutritious, and far better than what most prisoners had eaten in months or even years. Coffee deserves special mention because its abundance particularly struck men, accustomed to substitutes made from roasted grain or chicory root. Real coffee, brewed from actual beans, served at every meal without limit. Sugar to sweeten it, cream to lighten it. Prisoners could drink as much as they wanted, a liberty that seemed almost decadent. The smell of fresh coffee became one of the defining sensory memories of camp life, drifting through barracks and across recreation areas, a constant reminder that they were being fed better as prisoners than many of their families were eating back home. Holiday meals elevated abundance into theater. At Christmas in 1943, Camp Hearn served a feast that prisoners would remember for the rest of their lives. Roasted turkey with savory dressing, cranberry sauce providing sweet tart contrast, mashed potatoes swimming in gravy, buttered peas, fresh rolls, pumpkin pie for dessert, and cigars to finish the meal. Men ate until their stomachs ached, unable to process the contrast between this plenty and the deprivation they knew their relatives were experiencing. One officer wrote in his diary that night about the profound guilt he felt eating like a king while his family scrounged for every scrap. The cognitive dissonance was painful. How could the enemy treat them better than their own government treated German citizens? The camp also operated an internal economy that gave prisoners a measure of autonomy within their confinement. Each man received 80 cents per day in camp scrip, payment equivalent to what American privates earned as base pay. This artificial currency could be spent at the camp canteen, which stocked an array of items that would have been luxury goods in wartime Germany: cigarettes, soap, writing paper, envelopes, pencils, harmonicas, playing cards, and other sundries lined the shelves. The ability to choose, to exercise preference, to make small decisions about how to spend their earnings gave prisoners a sense of agency that mere survival did not provide. The jingle of script-changing hands, the casual conversations about what to buy, the complaints about prices or quality of goods, All of this mimicked normal economic life and created psychological distance from the reality of imprisonment. Sensory details accumulated into an overwhelming case against everything prisoners had been taught. The crack of wooden baseball bats echoed from recreation fields where Americans had taught their captives the national pastime. The smell of roasted peanuts sold at the canteen mingled with tobacco smoke from cigarettes bought with earned scrip. The texture of freshly laundered uniforms, washed weekly by camp facilities, felt luxurious compared to the lice-infested tunics they had worn in North African campaigns. Even the sound of the place spoke of order and relative comfort rather than desperate containment. Guards' footsteps on gravel paths, the bell announcing mealtimes, voices raised in conversation or laughter rather than screams or commands, barked in anger. The scale of the American prisoner of war system was itself a kind of power demonstration. By 1945, more than 400 major camps operated across the continental United States, holding over 400,000 German prisoners, in addition to smaller numbers of Italian and Japanese captives. The logistics of feeding, housing, and managing this population represented a stunning achievement of organization and resource allocation. Camp Hearn alone processed thousands of men through various work and education programs, maintained detailed records, ensured compliance with Geneva Convention requirements, and still operated smoothly enough that civilian observers often commented on its efficiency. Yet perhaps the single moment that crystallized the paradox most completely came on Christmas Eve, when local Texas families donated decorations for the camp's holiday celebration. A massive pine tree was erected in the main mess hall, its branches hung with ornaments and tinsel. American guards and German prisoners stood together singing carols, their voices blending in hymns that transcended national boundaries. Silent Night was particularly moving, sung in both English and German, with men from enemy nations harmonizing on a song about peace and divine blessing. One young soldier broke down crying during the carol, overwhelmed by the realization that his captors were honoring his culture's most sacred traditions, while his own leader back home offered nothing but continued war and sacrifice. This was the deepest cut to propaganda's hold on consciousness. The enemy was supposed to be godless, materialistic, culturally barren. Yet here, they were celebrating Christian holidays with prisoners, respecting religious observances, providing chaplains for Lutheran and Catholic services. The contradiction could not be explained away or rationalized into conformity with what they had been told. Either the propaganda had been lies, or reality was somehow playing tricks, and the evidence of their senses insisted on reality's truth. Beyond the fences of camps like Hearn, even stranger experiences awaited those prisoners who volunteered for work details. The opportunity to leave the compound during daylight hours, to labor in American fields and factories, to earn money and contribute to the society that held them captive. This represented yet another paradox layered upon all the others. When the call first went out for workers, many prisoners hesitated, suspicious of what such labor might entail. Would they be worked to death like slaves? Would they be punished for poor performance? Would civilian Americans treat them with the violence that guards had so far avoided? The reality proved entirely different. Trucks arrived at camp gates to transport work crews to nearby farms and businesses. The prisoners rode in open truck beds, watching the Texas landscape roll past, feeling the wind in their faces like free men heading to their jobs. When they arrived at work sites, they found themselves greeted by farmers and foremen who seemed more concerned with getting tasks done than with punishing enemies. Instructions were given clearly and without hostility. Work proceeded at a reasonable pace, and when the day ended, the prisoners rode back to camp, having earned wages and contributed labor that benefited the American war economy. The agricultural abundance they witnessed during these work details was staggering. Fields of cotton stretched to the horizon, the white bowls ready for harvest. Corn grew tall and thick, ears heavy with kernels. Wheat rippled golden in the wind, peanut vines sprawled across acres of sandy soil. The scale dwarfed what most prisoners had ever seen on European farms. American agriculture operated on a mechanized industrial basis that made traditional farming look primitive. Tractors pulled multi-row planters and harvesters. Combines cut and threshed grain in single passes. Irrigation systems drew water from wells to nourish crops during dry spells. The technology on display in American fields exceeded what was available to German farmers even before the war had disrupted everything. By 1944, nearly 200,000 German prisoners worked outside the camps regularly. In Texas alone, more than 20,000 helped with the cotton harvest, ensuring that millions of bales reached processing plants. In Iowa, prisoners picked corn by the ton. In Georgia, they gathered half the state's peanut crop. The labor-filled gaps left by American men serving overseas, keeping agricultural production at levels necessary to feed both military forces and civilian populations. And the prisoners, observing this abundance firsthand, could not help but compare it to conditions back home where food shortages were worsening and civilian morale was fraying. The sensory experience of farm labor embedded itself in memory. The sweet smell of fresh-cut hay mingled with the tang of diesel fuel from tractors. The rough texture of cotton bolls and peanut vines reminded hands accustomed to weapons of the reality of agricultural work. The relentless sun beat down on backs bent over row crops, but water was provided freely and breaks were scheduled regularly. No one drove them with whips or threatened violence for working too slowly. Instead, farmers treated them as hired help, temporary workers filling a need, human beings performing a job rather than enemies being punished through forced labor. Some farmers went beyond mere professional courtesy into actual kindness. Wives brought watermelons and sandwiches to the fields at midday, offering refreshment that exceeded any requirement or expectation. Jars of iced tea appeared on hot afternoons. A few farmers engaged prisoners in halting conversations, asking about their families or sharing stories about their own sons serving overseas. These human connections, brief and sometimes awkward, nevertheless carried weight. They contradicted the dehumanization that war required, reminded both sides that the men they faced were individuals with histories and hopes rather than mere representations of enemy nations. At the end of workdays, when prisoners rode back to camp in the beds of trucks, they often passed through small American towns. These glimpses of civilian life compounded the revelations of the fields. School children rode bicycles through quiet streets, their laughter ringing in the afternoon air. Neon signs flickered to life outside diners and drugstores, advertising ice cream and malted milk. Families pushed shopping carts through grocery stores visible through large plate glass windows, the shelves inside stocked with goods that would have been impossible to find in German cities. For the prisoners, these visions of normalcy in the midst of total war were almost painful to witness. Their own families were experiencing blackouts and bombing raids, rationing and privation. American families were apparently shopping for dinner and buying their children ice cream cones. The wages prisoners earned, though modest, gave them purchasing power within the camp economy, and even allowed some to send Red Cross parcels back to Europe. In a bitter irony, men captured in war now fed their families better than some German soldiers still fighting could manage. The scrip accumulated in footlockers represented not just buying power, but evidence of productive contribution, proof that even in captivity they could be useful rather than merely warehoused. Some prisoners took pride in their work, measuring their self-worth by the rows picked or bushels harvested. Others felt conflicted about aiding the enemy economy. But all of them recognized the paradox of prisoners living better than civilians at home. Statistics documented the scale of the contribution. By war's end, German POWs had provided more than 90 million man-days of labor across the United States. They harvested crops that fed millions, felled timber that built military installations, worked in paper mills and food processing plants, even laid roads and maintained infrastructure. The productivity was real and significant. America had transformed captive enemies into a workforce through contracts and compensation rather than coercion, demonstrating yet again that its approach to war diverged fundamentally from the totalitarian methods prisoners had been trained to accept as normal. But beyond economics, the most profound impacts came through individual human encounters that revealed shared humanity beneath the uniforms and ideologies. A farmer's daughter in Minnesota remembered a prisoner who helped her with algebra homework during breaks, patiently explaining concepts in broken English supplemented with drawings in the dirt. Another family recalled POWs playing violins at a barn dance, their music drifting across fields under the stars while Americans and Germans alike listened and danced. These moments of cultural exchange, informal and unplanned, created connections that transcended the war's divisions. They revealed that music, mathematics, laughter and kindness were not properties of any particular nation, but part of the common heritage of humanity. The propaganda that had shaped these prisoners painted America as soulless and materialistic, obsessed with money and lacking any depth of culture or spirit. Yet the evidence accumulated daily against that characterization. Americans displayed generosity that seemed rooted in genuine goodwill rather than calculation. They shared their food, their music, their time with men who had recently been trying to kill American soldiers. This wasn't weakness or naivete, but strength of a kind that had no place in the ideology prisoners had been fed. It suggested that a society built on individual liberty and human dignity might actually generate more cohesion and resilience than one built on rigid hierarchy and racial theory. For the men who worked outside the camps, each day eroded certainty a little more. The leader they served had promised a 1,000-year empire built on German superiority. Here in Texas or Iowa, or wherever their labor took them, they saw a different model, a society that fed both citizens and captives, fields so productive they could export food while maintaining abundance at home, technology that multiplied human labor rather than simply demanding more human suffering, and perhaps most subversive of all, ordinary kindness extended across enemy lines without expectation of return. The sensory memories of those work details would outlast the war itself. The clang of tractor engines starting in the pre-dawn darkness, the laughter of farm children playing in yards while their parents supervised harvest work, the smell of fresh bread baking in farmhouse kitchens, occasionally shared with hungry prisoners. These impressions accumulated into a counter-narrative, an alternative to everything they had been taught about how the world worked and how societies should be organized. Yet labor was only one dimension of the transformation occurring in camps across America. Another revolution was happening in the evenings and on days off, in classrooms and theaters that prisoners organized within the compounds. Education and culture would prove as powerful as any other factor in reshaping worldviews and preparing men for a different future than the one they had expected when they first went to war.